Hello everybody, it's Kenneth from the Archives here with another video dipping into our collections and the history of Dundee. Today I'm going to be looking at some photographs taken during the twilight days of the Tay Ferry, or as it was always known in Dundee, the Fifie. This photograph was taken by Professor George Howard Bell around about 1961. Now an awful lot of what you see in this photograph is gone, notably the West Station, which you can see in the front right of the picture. But a very familiar image which has disappeared is that of the ferry crossing the river, because here we see one of the Fifies, or the Tay Ferry to give it its Sunday title, crossing towards its terminus at Craig Pier, part of which you can see on the right of the photograph. Now there's a long history of ferry travel between Dundee and Fife. It was the main connection between the two, at least until the rail bridge came along, and even then it still flourished until the Tay Road Bridge. Prior to 1815, there was a lot of irregular, unregulated boats, various sizes, various leaving times, inconsistent services. There were some concerns about these. It was said they were mostly manned by people who had very little experience of the sea, the young, or elderly sailors who were no longer really able to cope with the rigours of a long journey, and this led to concerns about safety. There were also concerns about alcohol consumption among some of the sailors. Now, unfortunately, in 1815, there was an accident. One of the boats capsized, and this resulted in a significant loss of life. And this seems to have been the spur to finally get a regular service. A lot of the old boats were sold, regular boats were brought into operation. Eventually, the Dundee Harbour trustees took over the running of the service, and in 1819 we got an Act of Parliament to regulate. This led to the construction of proper ferry facilities and a fixed route. Well, initially two fixed routes between Dundee and Newport. Also in the early days there was a route between Dundee and Woodhaven, but that fairly quickly faded away. And that was what we ended up with, the route between Craig Pier, where Dundee's ferry terminal was built, and you can see it in 1846 on the plan by Charles Edward, and later in the 19th century here. Obviously it was conveniently located when the railways came in. It was also near the centre of the town. The other big development in the early days happened exactly 200 years ago when the first steam ferry was purchased to run the route. That was a vessel known as the Union, and it was the first of many powered vessels to perform the service over the years. But here are the final two, again in this picture by Professor Bell. The almost identical MV Abercraig, which was built in Paisley in 1939. It was a motor vessel, the first motor vessel to be used on the service, and its sister ship, the Scots Craig, which was built in 1951. Now, part of the reason for the delay was due to the war. What had generally happened was there would be pairs of Fifies, but there would always be one kept back from an earlier period to run as a spare service. And at the end, we had both the Abercraig and the Scots Craig, the modern vessels, as the main vessels running the service, but we also had an earlier vessel, the BL Nairn, which was the last paddle steamer built to operate the route. She was built again in Dundee in 1929, and this photograph taken by Professor Cook shows her in dock at Craig Pier. She would be brought in if there was a need for an extra vessel or one of the other vessels had failed. Prior to the Scots Craig, she'd been one of the main vessels, and prior to the Abercraig, the other main vessel had been her sister ship, the William High, which became the Sir William High when he was knighted, but it was scrapped in the 1950s. Here, a view taken by Professor Bell from one of the vessels looking towards Dundee, and it gives you an idea of what a spectacular view you must have got from the Fifie. And today you can just imagine with Dundee's regenerated waterfront what that would look like. Of course, it was the road bridge that doomed the Fifie, and here we have two pictures taken from Fifies by Professor Cook. On the left, we can see the road bridge starting to take shape. We can also see that on the right, but we can see that the two Fifies were passing each other. Not sure if that's the Scots Craig or the Abercraig. I think it might be the Abercraig. So that would mean this was taken from the Scots Craig. So in 1966, the bridge opened and the Fifie service ceased. That meant that the terminus in Dundee was basically left rather redundant. The Fifies themselves, well, the BL Nairn was sold for scrap. The Scots Craig and the Abercraig ended up in Malta. The Scots Craig didn't last that long, was scrapped sometime in the 1980s. The Abercraig lasted a little bit longer, and as late as 1994 was still in a condition where it was felt she might be salvageable, although sadly neglected, and there were talks about bringing her back to Dundee. Unfortunately, before the necessary funding or planning could get off the ground, there was pressure in Malta for the area of the dockyard she was in to be cleared up, and she was very sadly scrapped in 1995, ending the last link. The one thing to come out, though, was what were we going to do with Craig Pier? Well, of course, in 1986, another famous Dundee ship, Discovery, returned to Dundee, and it was decided that Craig Pier would be the ideal site to develop the new visitor centre, Discovery Point, to house her, and that opened on the site in 1992. So Craig Pier may no longer be the site of the Tay Ferry, but is still very connected to Dundee's maritime past. Okay, I hope you found that video interesting. In the meantime, stay safe, take care, and we'll talk again soon.